Welcome to Green Mountain Quilts. I'm Paula Doyle and I'm going to show you how I make my mini mosaic quilted projects. I'm going to show you all the basics on how to make the mini mosaic quilted projects while I make my festival mini mosaic quilt block. The basic idea of mini mosaics is that all of the pieces for the block are cut into square tiles. In this case, 1.5 inches square, 1 inch finished size. And we have various different types of tile that make up the mini mosaic festival block. For example, we have plain square tiles, that's 1.5 inches by 1.5 inches. We have half rectangle square tiles that are 1.5 inches also, half triangle square tiles, quarter square triangle tiles, and half and quarter square triangle tiles. And all of those are used when we make up our festival quilt block. I cut all of my mini mosaic tiles from fat quarters of fabric. And fat quarter is a piece of fabric which is 18 inches by 22 inches, or approximately 45 by 55 centimeters if you're in metric. And I like all of my strips for the mini mosaic tiles to be at least 20 inches long because that gives me better use of fabric. What I do first is I take my fat quarter and I fold it in half along the original crosswise grain, and then I'm going to cut 1.5 inch strips and then 1.5 inch squares for my plain tiles. You can do this using your regular rotary cutting equipment if you wish. I particularly like to use the Shape Cut ruler by June Taylor because that has slots every 1/2 inch that I can use to cut numerous strips at a time. In order to make the 1.5 inch cutting easier, I like to put a piece of tape on next to the teardrops where I'm going to be inserting my rotary cutter, and that just makes it a lot faster and easier for me to determine where I need to cut. So I simply line up the folders of fabric with one of the lines on the ruler, insert my rotary blade into the teardrop shape, and cut as many strips as I need to. There we go. There are 2 strips ready to be cut. And what I do is I take the strip, and in order to cut squares, I line the strip up with one of the lines on my rotary mat. And then I use the Shape Cut tool again and simply line up the raw edge of the fabric with the lines on the ruler and cut myself some nice square tiles of fabric. There we are, and just like that I have some plain mini mosaic tiles to go into my project. The next type of tile I'm going to show you how to make is the half rectangle mini mosaic tile. What I do is I start with 1 inch strips of fabric stitched together with a 1/4 inch seam, and then I press the seam allowance open to spread the weight of the fabric. The next thing I do is I simply take that set of fabric and cut it into squares using my Shape Cut ruler again. And just like that, I have my half rectangle mini mosaic square tiles ready to go into the project. The next type of tile I'm going to show you how to make is a half triangle square tile. To do this, I start out with 2 1.5 inch strips of fabric cut at least 20 inches long, and I'm going to stitch them right sides together lengthwise using a 1/4 inch seam. I'm just stitching those two right sides together with my 1/4 inch seam. I line up about 6 inches at a time, then embed the needle and line up about another 6 inches and stitch. I finished stitching my strips together now, and now I'm going to press the seam allowance on that set open, just to help distribute the weight of the fabric in the finished tile a bit more evenly. So I have a set here I did before with the seam allowance pressed open, and now I need to cut my half square triangles from that. To do that, I simply have freezer paper templates that are cut 1.5 inches square using the rotary cutter. You can do this with plain freezer paper, or you could indeed cut the squares from gridded freezer paper using your scissors. Either way, you should have plenty of these squares cut 1.5 inches square. And all we do is take the templates and iron them onto the sets of fabric, shiny side down, so that the seam line crosses the square of freezer paper diagonally, point to point. And here's one I did earlier. After that, it's simply a matter of cutting those units apart and using your scissors to cut along the edges of the freezer paper to cut out your 1.5 inch square, half square triangle tile. And you simply peel off the freezer paper, and hey presto, you've got your 1.5 inch half square triangle tile ready to go into the project.